Tonight, we're going to step softly into a world that most of us would rather not visit: colonial childbirth. This is history at its most personal, most dangerous, and honestly, most exhausting. So tuck yourself in, get comfortable, and let's slow down time together, because for colonial women, time felt very, very slow when labor started, and it was only the beginning of their trials. Picture it. It's the 17th or 18th century, somewhere in early America. The streets outside are dirt, maybe packed down with mud if it's been raining. The houses are wooden, smoky inside from the fireplace. And medicine, well, medicine is more about prayers and poultices than science. People are tough out of necessity. Life is built around survival, and yet survival is never guaranteed. Now, imagine you are a woman in this world, and you find out you're pregnant. There's no prenatal testing, no ultrasound, no books telling you what fruit size your baby is this week. There are no epidurals waiting to rescue you at the last minute. And there is no guarantee that you or your baby will make it through what's coming. In fact, childbirth is one of the leading causes of death for women in this period. The first thing you might do is start gathering supplies: linen for swaddling, clean cloths if you can afford them, herbs your neighbors say will help ease the pain. But the most important thing you'll need is a midwife. Colonial midwives were the guardians of birth. Some are highly skilled, with years of experience, while others were simply the only person available who had seen more than one birth before. Their job was as much spiritual as medical. They prayed with you, comforted you, and in some cases, physically held you up during the worst moments. Labor could last hours, even days. Without modern interventions, women had to endure every contraction naturally. Some midwives recommended walking to get things moving. Others swore by certain teas or broths. There were even rituals and prayers that were recited to help protect the mother and child. Because for a colonial woman, childbirth wasn't just physical, it was a deeply spiritual event. Here's something to picture. You're in a small wooden house, probably dimly lit, maybe by candles, maybe by a small fire. The room is warm, almost too warm, because the windows are shut to keep out the cold night air. Your female relatives or neighbors are with you, and everyone is whispering, waiting. The midwife tells you to stay calm, to trust your body, even though the pain is becoming unbearable. There are no painkillers beyond maybe a bit of strong cider or rum, which might take the edge off, but probably won't do much more than make you dizzy. When the moment finally comes, it's a storm. Everyone rushes to their place. One person to support your head, another to hold your hand. The midwife is watching closely, waiting for the baby's head to appear. There are no monitors, no fetal heart rate checks, no surgical teams standing by if something goes wrong. If the baby is stuck, the midwife has to act quickly with the tools she has, which might just be her own two hands. Sometimes, everything goes well. The baby cries, the mother cries, everyone exhales, and the room fills with relief. But sometimes it doesn't. There were high rates of stillbirth, high rates of infection, high rates of women dying from complications like hemorrhage. These women knew the risks, and they faced them with courage we can barely imagine today. Would you be able to face childbirth like this? No pain relief, no guarantees, just faith and endurance? Drop a comment and let me know if you think you could handle it, or if you'd already be running for the nearest time machine back to modern medicine. But there's more to the story than the danger. There is also an incredible community aspect. Childbirth was a social event, sometimes called lying in. Female friends, neighbors, and relatives gathered to support the mother, to share advice, and to make sure she wasn't alone. There was food, warmth, and company, at least in the moments before and after the storm. In many ways, this created a bond that was deeply powerful. As the newborn was wrapped and handed to its mother, there were prayers said, blessings whispered, sometimes tears shed for the women who weren't there, the ones who hadn't survived their own labors. It was a mix of joy and grief, of life and death existing side by side. This first look is just setting the stage. In the next part, we'll go deeper into what labor actually felt like, the superstitions that surrounded childbirth, and the shocking methods midwives sometimes used when things went wrong. Would you want a whole room of neighbors around you while giving birth? Or would you rather do it quietly and alone? I'm curious. Let me know in the comments. Early reflective question. Would you be able to face childbirth like this? Closing comment question. Would you want a whole room of neighbors around you?
Let's settle back in and pick up where we left off. The baby isn't here yet, not even close. Labor in the colonial era was slow, unpredictable, and had a cruel sense of humor. It could start suddenly in the middle of the night, or creep up so gradually that a woman had time to finish her chores, make dinner, and still wait hours before anything truly happened. There was no way to know whether this labor would be quick and simple or a multi-day ordeal. Pain was, of course, expected. There was no concept of painless childbirth. In fact, some religious leaders thought that pain was a divine punishment, a reminder of Eve's transgression in the Garden of Eden. You suffered because you were meant to suffer. That's comforting, isn't it? Nothing like having a minister tell you that your pain is all part of a celestial lesson plan. Midwives, however, had a more practical approach. They might brew teas from herbs like pennyroyal, blue cohosh, or raspberry leaf. Herbs believed to help ease contractions or speed up labor. Did they work? Maybe sometimes. Sometimes they just made the mother vomit, which, oddly enough, some midwives also consider helpful because it was thought to move the labor along. When the pain became too intense, some women were given a strong drink. Rum or cider were common choices. This was not so much to dull the pain as to dull the senses, just enough to make the experience bearable. And yes, there were even a few midwives who were not shy about telling the husband to take a sip as well, because nobody needed him fainting at the wrong moment. But even with these attempts at comfort, the pain could be overwhelming. Women screamed, cried, prayed, begged, or sometimes fell into a strange calm, enduring in silence because there was nothing else to do. The community of women in the room played a crucial role. They rubbed her back, wiped her face, told her stories, reminded her to breathe. This was one of the few spaces in colonial life that was truly female-centered, where women supported women without interruption from men. Now, let's talk about some of the remedies that make us raise our eyebrows today. Some midwives recommended hanging the woman's clothes on the door to open the way for the baby. Others suggested tying and untying knots during labor as a symbolic act. The baby's passage would untie just as the knots did, and in more desperate cases, charms or amulets were placed on the bed. Prayers were said out loud, and every superstition was put into action just in case one of them worked. The actual mechanics of labor were, of course, complicated. The midwife had to watch for signs that the baby was coming head first, because a breech birth, feet first, was incredibly dangerous. Without surgical options, a breech birth often meant the death of the baby, sometimes a mother. So midwives developed techniques to try to turn the baby manually, often in very difficult circumstances. Imagine doing that by firelight, with no sterile gloves, no pain relief, and no guarantee that it would succeed. Would you trust a midwife in this situation, or would you rather take your chances alone? Drop a thought in the comments. I'd love to know what you think about that level of trust. Sometimes, after hours and hours, the baby would finally arrive. But sometimes, the baby wouldn't cry. There were no NICUs, no emergency teams. The midwife might rub the baby with salt, blow gently into its mouth, or even dunk it briefly in cold water to shock it into breathing. If that failed, there was only mourning. And if the baby lived but the mother did not, the entire household changed forever. Widowed husbands often remarried quickly, not out of coldness, but because someone had to take care of the baby, the other children, and the home. Motherhood was so dangerous that in some communities, it wasn't unusual for a man to have 3 or 4 wives across a lifetime. Each one lost a childbirth. Let's not forget the mothers who did survive. After delivery, they faced days of recovery, lying in, as it was called, to allow their bodies to heal. They were encouraged to stay in bed, drink broth, and regain strength. Sometimes, neighbors would come by to cook meals or help with chores. But infections were common, and fevers could set in days later, sometimes killing the mother when everyone thought she was out of danger. This quiet, fragile moment after childbirth was a time of both relief and dread. It was a reminder that survival was not guaranteed, even when the worst seemed over. If you had to go through a colonial childbirth, which part would scare you the most? The pain the risk of infection, or the uncertainty afterward? Tell me in the comments. I'm curious how modern minds weigh those fears. Let's drift gently onward, because childbirth was only the beginning of a colonial woman's struggles. Next, we'll explore what happened after the baby was born, the feeding, the swaddling, and the very strange beliefs about newborn care. Would you have been brave enough to face another pregnancy after one terrifying birth? Let me know. I think I'd be inventing excuses to just focus on my weaving for the rest of my life. Would you trust a midwife in this situation, or would you rather take your chances alone? Which part would scare you the most? The pain, the risk of infection, or the uncertainty afterward? Would you have been brave enough to face another pregnancy after one terrifying birth? So now the baby is here, and everyone has survived, at least for now. The room smells with smoke, sweat, and relief. The midwife has cleaned up what she could, which usually meant washing the linens in a bucket of hot water, if there was enough fuel for it. Someone has probably lit another candle, and the new mother is lying back, exhausted, damp with sweat, wrapped in blankets. If she's lucky, she has an hour of peace before the real work begins. Postpartum life in colonial America was called lying in, and it was an important period both medically and socially. The mother was encouraged, sometimes forced, to stay in bed for several days. This wasn't just to recover physically. It was seen as a time of purification. Her body had done something monumental, and now it needed to be brought back to balance. Some women were given special diets, warm broth, milk, bread soaked in wine if they could afford it. They were kept warm because it was believed that the body was in a vulnerable state, open to evil influences and bad airs. In some communities, the room was kept closed and dark, with only women allowed to enter. The new mother was not expected to cook, clean, or do heavy work during this time. Which sounds nice, until you realize this rest period might last just a few days before she was expected to be back at her chores, washing clothes, hauling water, tending fires, and of course, caring for the baby around the clock. And caring for a colonial newborn was a very hands-on, often very peculiar process. First, there was swaddling. Newborns were wrapped tightly in strips of cloth, binding their arms and legs straight to prevent them from flailing. This wasn't just to keep them warm. It was believed that if a baby wasn't swaddled properly, their limbs might grow crooked. So infants were sometimes wrapped up like tiny mummies, changed only a few times a day, and kept that way for months. Imagine being a newborn and unable to move your arms for half a year. Would you have been a calm, swaddled baby, or a tiny colonial rebel kicking against the cloth? Tell me in the comments which one you think you'd be. I suspect I'd be the kind who figured out how to wriggle free just to annoy everyone. Feeding the baby was another crucial task. Breastfeeding was a norm, but it wasn't always possible. If the mother couldn't produce enough milk, or if she died, a wet nurse might be found. Sometimes a neighbor would nurse two babies, her own and the orphaned or motherless child, at the same time. If no wet nurse was available, the family might try to feed the baby cow's milk or goat's milk using a small rag as a makeshift teat, which was risky because of spoilage and lack of sterilization. And then there was a constant worry about disease. Infant mortality rates were heartbreakingly high. Measles, dysentery, pneumonia. Any of these could take a baby within days. Parents often didn't name the baby right away, waiting until they were sure it would survive the first month or two. Naming a child who might not live was seen as tempting fate. Because of this constant shadow of death, colonial parents often seemed stern or emotionally distant by our standards. But it was a survival mechanism. Losing a baby was so common that they had to guard their hearts. That doesn't mean they didn't grieve. Diaries from the time are filled with entries mourning the loss of infants. But they had to carry on. There were fields to plow, meals to make, other children to feed. Life didn't stop. And then there were the old wives' tales. Some communities believed you should never cut a baby's nails before they were a year old, or they'd grow up to be a thief. Others believed that if you rocked an empty cradle, you were inviting death into the home. Babies were sometimes given a little bit of rum or sugar water to calm them. Not exactly the pediatrician-approved method we'd use today. Would you have trusted these folk remedies, or would you have tried to invent something more scientific? I'd love to hear which camp you think you belong to, the Urban Prayer Team, or the Early Experimental Medicine Club. As the mother slowly regained her strength, she also had to navigate her return to the outside world. In many Christian communities, she underwent a churching ceremony, a ritual of purification before she could rejoin public worship. This wasn't meant as an insult, though it sounds like one now. It was more of a blessing, a formal welcome back into society. But of course, there was little time to bask in the glow of survival. Another pregnancy could come quickly, sometimes within months. Colonial women might give birth to 10 or 12 children over a lifetime, knowing that only half might survive to adulthood. This constant cycle of pregnancy, birth, and loss shaped their entire existence. Can you imagine living in that rhythm? Pregnant nearly every year, always preparing for either joy or heartbreak. Drop a comment if you think you'd be able to stay resilient, or if you'd be trying to invent 18th century birth control methods in secret. Let's drift forward now into the next phase, because colonial childhood itself was not exactly the carefree romp we might imagine. In the next part, we'll explore what it was like to actually grow up in this world, the work children were expected to do, the strict discipline, and the ways families tried to keep them alive through smallpox, scarlet fever, and all the other hazards waiting outside the cradle. Would you want to grow up in a colonial family with 8 siblings? Or do you think you prefer the quieter modern childhood we know today? Could you handle being pregnant almost every year? Would you want to grow up in a colonial family with 8 siblings? Now that our tiny swaddle baby has survived the first few months, we can start thinking about what it was actually like to be a child in the colonies. The answer? Busy. Very busy. Childhood as we know it today, carefree, full of school plays and soccer practice, did not really exist. In colonial America, as soon as you were able to walk without falling into the fireplace, you were probably put to work. Your early years were still dangerous. Of course, children were incredibly vulnerable to disease. Measles, whooping cough, diphtheria, smallpox, all of these could sweep through a village and take several siblings at once. Colonial parents sometimes lost 3, 4, or 5 children across a lifetime, and they had to keep going because there were crops to tend, clothes to wash, candles to make. If you made it past the dangerous toddler years, congratulations. You were now old enough to be useful. Very young children were put to work doing simple tasks like feeding chickens, gathering eggs, or carrying firewood. You might spend hours spinning flax into thread or helping to card wool. By age 6 or 7, you were already a contributing member of the household economy. Imagine being a child with no toys except maybe a corn husk doll or a carved wooden animal. Would you have found ways to entertain yourself, or would you have staged an 18th century tantrum out of sheer boredom? Tell me in the comments which kind of colonial kid you think you'd have been. Education was not universal, but it was important in some colonies, especially New England, where Puritans placed a heavy emphasis on reading, mainly so children could study the Bible. Boys might be sent to a one-room schoolhouse if one was available. Girls were often taught at home, though some also attended dame schools run by older women in the community. But school was not exactly fun. Lessons were strict and heavily focused on memorization. Discipline was severe, yes, the dreaded switch or rod was real. If you forgot your lesson, you might be smacked on the hand. If you spoke out of turn, you could be made to stand in the corner with a sign around your neck. This was not the era of participation trophies. And then there was church. Sundays were not a day of rest for children so much as a day of enforced stillness. Colonial church services could last 2 or 3 hours. Children were expected to sit perfectly still, and there were even church officers who carried long sticks to poke or tap anyone, including grown men who started to nod off. Would you have been able to sit still for 3 hours in an unheated church? Or would you have been on the receiving end of the church officer's stick? Drop a comment. I'd be fidgeting by the first of them personally. As children grew older, their responsibilities increased. Boys might be apprenticed to a trade at around age 12 or 14, blacksmithing, carpentry, printing. Apprenticeship contracts could last for years, during which time the boy lived with his master's family and was expected to work hard in exchange for learning the trade. Girls, meanwhile, were often trained in domestic skills, spinning, weaving, cooking, preserving food, everything needed to run a household. Recreation did exist, but it was practical. Children played games that taught coordination or social skills, tag, hoop rolling, marbles, or blind man's bluff. Winter brought sledding on wooden boards, and summer meant swimming in rivers or climbing trees. But all play was balanced with work, because in a subsistence economy, everyone had to contribute. And of course, there was danger everywhere. Fire was a constant threat. Many children died from falling into open hearths or tipping over kettles of boiling water. Wells and rivers were risky, too. And since there were no real hospitals, a broken arm or infected wound could become fatal. Think about your own childhood. Could you imagine living in a house where the biggest threat wasn't stepping on a Lego, but literally falling into a pot of boiling stew? Tell me in the comments how long you think you'd last before your first accident. Colonial children also had to deal with early responsibility. By their early teens, girls might already be considered a marriageable age, especially in frontier areas where survival often meant starting families young. Boys might be sent away from home to work as apprentices or hired hands, leaving their childhood homes behind for good. The expectation was clear. Children were miniature adults in training. They were not coddled, and their mistakes had real consequences. If a child misbehaved, it was seen as a sign of poor moral discipline, not just youthful energy. Parents believed that children needed to be shaped and corrected constantly so they would grow into godly, productive members of society. Would you thrive under that kind of structure or rebel against it at every turn? I'd love to hear whether you think you'd be the obedient colonial child or the one sneaking out to skip chores. By the time a child reached adulthood, usually by their late teens, they had been through a gauntlet of survival, hard work, strict rules, and constant risks. But those who made it through were tough, resourceful, and prepared for the harsh realities of adult colonial life. Let's drift into that next stage together. In the next part, we'll explore what adulthood looked like in colonial times, the marriages, the daily work, the endless chores, and the social expectations that governed everything from how you dressed to how you greeted your neighbors. If you had to grow up in a family with constant work and strict rules, would you emerge disciplined and ready for adult life? Or slightly traumatized but very good at telling stories? Would you have found ways to entertain yourself, or staged an 18th century tantrum? Could you sit still for 3 hours? How long would you last before your first accident? Would you emerge disciplined or just very good at telling stories? By the time you reached adulthood in the colonies, you're already a seasoned survivor. You've beaten smallpox, stayed out of the hard fire, learned to work from the moment you could hold a broom. And now it's time to do it all as an adult. Congratulations. Let's start with the biggest truth about colonial adulthood. It was relentless. Life revolved around labor. If you were a farmer, as most colonists were, your day began before the sun was up. You were out feeding livestock, chopping wood, and preparing fields before you even had breakfast. Farming was backbreaking work with no tractors, no machinery, and no safety gear. Just hand tools and pure muscle. If you were a woman, your day started just as early, maybe earlier, because you were responsible for feeding the entire household. That meant baking bread, milking cows, collecting eggs, and getting a fire started before dawn. Cooking alone was practically a full-time job. And don't forget laundry day, boiling water, scrubbing clothes by hand, rinsing them in icy water, then hanging them to dry. Would you survive colonial laundry day? Be honest. We complain about waiting for the washing machine to finish. Drop a comment if you think you'd last through a single day of scrubbing over a steaming kettle. Marriage was expected, and most people married young, usually in their early 20s, sometimes even earlier. Courtship was practical, not romantic. You needed a partner who could work hard and help run a household. There were barn dances and gatherings where young people could meet, but make no mistake, this was not about finding your soulmate. It was about survival. Imagine being judged as a good match not for your looks or charm, but for your ability to churn butter and mend fences. Would you have been considered a good prospect in colonial times? Tell me in the comments whether you think you'd impress at a barn dance or just hide in the corner with the cider jug. Once married, couples were expected to build a household almost immediately. That meant constructing or inheriting a home, clearing land, and starting a family. Children were both a blessing and a necessity. More hands to work the farm, more security for the future. But childbirth was still dangerous, and infant mortality remained high. Women often had 6, 8, even 10 children over a lifetime, knowing some might not survive. Daily life was a balancing act between work and survival. Men spent long days in the fields or at trades like blacksmithing, carpentry, or milling. Women spent long days inside and outside the house, sewing, spinning, preserving food, tending gardens, making soap, brewing beer, and keeping everyone alive and clothed. Food was simple and seasonal. If it was winter, you were eating whatever you had managed to preserve: salted meat, dried beans, root vegetables. Fresh fruit was a rare treat, unless you lived near orchards. Sugar was expensive, so desserts were special occasion luxuries. Would you have been content with a diet of cornmeal, salted pork, and maybe a bit of molasses? Or would you be dreaming of pizza by week 2? Let me know in the comments which colonial dish you'd try first. Social expectations were strict. Men were expected to be providers and protectors, women to be industrious homemakers. Religion played a huge role. Sunday church was mandatory in many places, and neighbors kept close watch on each other's behavior. Gossip spread fast in small communities. Imagine living in a world where everyone knew your business, and even skipping church could get you fined. Would you toe the line or risk being the talk of the town? Drop a comment. I think most of us would have a hard time keeping all those rules straight. And there was always danger. Wild animals, accidents, house fires, hostile weather, and, depending on the region and era, the threat of raids or military conflict. Colonial adulthood demanded constant vigilance. Even recreation was practical. Quilting bees, barn raisings, and harvest festivals were all social events, but they also got work done. Music and dancing existed, yes, but they were carefully scheduled around labor. And when night fell, there was no Netflix, no scrolling on your phone, just a dark house, a flickering candle, and an early bedtime so you could wake before dawn and do it all again. Would you thrive in a world where work never stopped? Or would you sneak out to find a quiet hill just to sit and breathe for a while? Tell me if you think colonial adulthood would make you tougher or just tired. But life wasn't only hardship. There was pride in running a successful farm, raising a strong family, and knowing your labor kept everyone fed. Neighbors relied on each other. People built communities, helped one another harvest, celebrated weddings together, and mourned together when tragedy struck. And maybe, just maybe, that made their lives feel meaningful in a way we sometimes miss today. Next, we're going to look at colonial danger and disaster, the fires, the epidemics, the storms, and the wars that could wipe out everything you had worked for overnight. Because if you thought adulthood was tough, wait until you see what happened when disaster came knocking. Would you survive colonial laundry day? Would you be a good prospect at a barn dance? Which colonial dish would you try first? Would you toe the line or risk being the talk of the town? Would colonial adulthood make you tougher or just tired? If you thought colonial adulthood was already a full-time job, now we get to talk about the random disasters that could erase all that hard work in one afternoon. Because colonial life wasn't just about staying busy. It was about staying lucky. Let's start with the most common and most terrifying threat: fire. Colonial houses were made of wood, roofed with thatch or shingles, and kept warm by open hearths. Candles were everywhere. Lamps burned whale oil. Sparks were inevitable. And there were no fire departments, just buckets, neighbors, and prayers. Imagine sitting down to your simple dinner of cornbread and salt pork when someone shouts that the barn is on fire. The whole family would drop everything, form a bucket line, and hope for the best. If the fire spread to the house, it could mean losing everything you owned in minutes. Would you be calm in a colonial fire, or would you just grab the bread and run? Tell me in the comments if you think you'd have the presence of mind to join the bucket line, or if you'd be hiding behind the nearest tree until the flames died down. Next up, epidemics. Smallpox, measles, diphtheria, typhus, all regular visitors to colonial towns. And with little medical knowledge, no antibiotics, and no real hospitals, these diseases cut through communities with brutal efficiency. Quarantine might be imposed, but good luck enforcing it when people had a farm to eat. Imagine half your neighbors coughing, half your children sick, and still having to milk the cow before dawn. Colonial medicine was creative: bleeding, purging, blistering. All the treatments that sound like medieval torture were still in fashion? Would you submit to having a doctor drain some of your blood to rebalance your humors? Tell me in the comments if you trust colonial medicine or just drink herbal tea and hope for the best. Then there was the weather. Colonial life meant you were at the mercy of nature. A bad harvest could mean hunger for an entire year. A late frost might kill your crops. Drought could ruin the hayfield, leaving animals to starve. And winter could be deadly if you didn't chop enough firewood. Picture a January blizzard outside, snow creeping under the door, your only light a candle, your only heat a fire that's slowly burning to the last of the wood pile. Would you have rationed well enough to survive the winter? Or would you have been that neighbor showing up sheepishly asking to borrow some beans? And then, of course, there were more dramatic dangers, raids and wars. Depending on when and where you lived, you could face attacks from rival colonies, local militias, or conflict with native nations. Frontier life especially meant living with the possibility that armed strangers might appear on the horizon. Would you stay on the frontier, knowing the risk, or move closer to town, trading danger for gossip and nosy neighbors? Tell me where you think you'd settle in the colonies, the wild edge of settlement or the relative safety of the village green. Even peacetime had its hazards. Traveling between towns meant rough, muddy roads, rickety bridges, and bandits on occasion. Crossing rivers was risky, especially in spring floods. Falling off a horse could be a serious, even fatal, injury. But perhaps the most overlooked danger was exhaustion. Colonists lived with constant, low-level anxiety about survival. A single bad harvest, one serious injury, one house fire. Any of these could send a family into disaster. It wasn't just physical toughness they needed, it was mental resilience. Do you think you could handle living with that constant pressure, or would you lie awake every night listening for the sound of crackling fire or a sick child coughing? Tell me in the comments if you think colonial stress would keep you awake, or just knock you out from sheer fatigue. And yet, somehow, people found a way to keep going. Fires were put out, houses rebuilt, fields replanted, and children raised. Communities pulled together. Neighbors helped one another rebuild after tragedy. Colonial life was harsh, but was also built on cooperation. That sense of solidarity, of being part of something bigger, might be what kept people from giving up entirely. After all, when disaster struck, you want to be sure you had neighbors willing to show up with buckets, shovels, and food. Next, we'll drift into something a little more personal: colonial love, courtship, and marriage customs. Because somehow, in between all the disasters and endless work, people still found time to fall in love, pass notes, and sneak glances at barn dances. Would you join the bucket line or run? Would you trust colonial doctors or just stay home? Would you ration well enough to last winter? Would you risk the frontier or stay close to town gossip? Would colonial stress keep you awake, or just wear you down? After fires, blizzards, and smallpox outbreaks, it might seem like romance wouldn't have much of a chance. But human beings are remarkably stubborn when it comes to falling in love, even if it means writing love notes by firelight or walking 5 miles in mud just to see someone's face. Colonial courtship wasn't exactly candlelit dinners and long walks on the beach. For one thing, privacy was hard to come by. Most houses had 1 or 2 rooms. So when a young man came to call on a young woman, they were often carefully supervised, either by sitting on opposite ends of a bench in front of the entire family, or in some cases, being allowed to talk privately in the same bed under strict supervision. Yes, bundling was a real thing, where a courting couple would lie together fully clothed, often with a wooden board between them, to talk through the night. Would you be able to focus on romance with an entire family in the next room listening? Or would you suddenly remember that you have to go home and feed the chickens? Tell me in the comments if you think you'd handle colonial dating well, or just stay single forever to avoid the embarrassment. Marriage wasn't always about love, though. In many cases, it was about practicality, combining farmland, creating alliances, or simply ensuring survival. Large families meant more hands for farm work, but also more mouths to feed. Childbearing was constant, risky, and exhausting, yet considered essential. Imagine being newly married and immediately expected to start having children. No long honeymoon, no finding yourself. Just work, babies, and more work. Would you thrive in that kind of life, or secretly dream of running away to the city. Even weddings were more practical than glamorous. There were no lavish white dresses, unless you were very wealthy. A woman might just wear her best dress, the one she already owned, and the ceremony could be followed by a simple meal and a return to chores the next day. And yet, there was joy, barn dances, quilting bees, husking parties. Communities found ways to celebrate life together. Romance existed alongside the hard work, not in place of it. Would you enjoy barn dances and husking parties? Or would you stand in the corner hoping no one asked you to join? Tell me if you think colonial community events sound charming or just exhausting. As we drift onward, we'll leave behind the courting couples and turn to colonial childhood, a surprisingly serious and sometimes harsh experience. Colonial childhood was short, very short. Children were often put to work as soon as they could walk and talk. Toddlers might carry small sticks to the fire. By age 6 or 7, children could herd animals, weed gardens, or carry water from a well. There weren't many toys, either. A rag doll, a carved wooden animal, or a hoop to roll along the road was considered plenty. Most games were played outside and often involved chores cleverly disguised as play. Fetch the eggs could easily become an afternoon's entertainment. Would you have enjoyed a colonial childhood with so little free time? Or would you have staged a tiny rebellion, refusing to churn butter one more time? Tell me in the comments if you think you'd be a model colonial child or a very small troublemaker. Schooling was not guaranteed. If children were taught to read, it was often so they could read the Bible. Writing and arithmetic came second. Schools could be one-room log cabins with all ages learning together. The teacher might be strict. Corporal punishment was common. Imagine sitting on a hard bench all day, scratching letters on a hornbook while trying not to attract the teacher's attention. Would you prefer that to modern schooling, or would you sneak out the window at the first chance? Childhood also carried risks. Illness struck children hardest, and many families lost multiple children to disease. Parents expected some of their children might not survive to adulthood, which created a strange mix of deep love and emotional distance. Would you be resilient enough to grow up with that reality, or would it change how you viewed the world entirely? Tell me if you think colonial childhood sounds character-building or just tragic. Let's drift onward now to something that touches every part of colonial life: food. Because what they ate and didn't eat reveals a lot about how they survived. Food in the colonies was a mixture of necessity and creativity. Most families grew or raised most of what they ate. Corn was a staple, baked into bread, pounded into mush, or boiled into pudding. Salt pork was common, along with whatever vegetables were in season. Would you enjoy a steady diet of corn and salted meat, or would you start daydreaming about pizza after day 3? Tell me your survival menu in the comments. What colonial food could you actually live on? Seasonality was everything. In summer, there was abundance: fresh vegetables, fruit, milk. In winter, it was dry beans, salted meat, and root vegetables that had been stored in a cellar. If you didn't plan ahead, you might face hunger before spring. Colonial cooking involved open hearths and heavy iron pots. Meals took hours to prepare. Bread had to be kneaded by hand, and ovens had to be preheated with fires before baking. Would you have the patience to cook over an open fire every day, or would you just eat apples and call it good? Colonists were surprisingly resourceful. They brewed cider, made maple sugar, smoked fish, and pickled vegetables. Spices were precious, so food could be a little bland, unless you had money to import nutmeg or cinnamon. Imagine the excitement of getting a rare shipment of sugar or tea. Would you hoard it or share it with the neighbors? Tell me in the comments if you'd be generous or secretly keep the good stuff for yourself. With food handled, we can turn to faith and community life, the glue that held colonial society together. Religion was central to colonial life. For many, it was the reason they were there at all. Church services could last for hours, and attendance was expected. Would you sit still through a 3-hour sermon on a hard wooden bench? Or would you find yourself staring at the ceiling beams counting spiders? Tell me in the comments how long you'd last before quietly nodding off. Church wasn't just about faith. It was also social. Announcements were made, disputes settled, marriages arranged, and news spread. It was a Facebook of the 17th century. Colonial communities also had regular events like militia musters, market days, and seasonal festivals. Even work could become social. Barn raisings, husking bees, and quilting circles brought neighbors together. Would you thrive in that kind of close-knit world, or secretly wish for a little privacy? The calendar was marked by planting and harvest seasons, religious holidays, and practical concerns like sheep shearing or cider making. Life followed the rhythms of the land, not the clock. Imagine living in a world where darkness meant stopping work because there was no electric light. Would that feel peaceful or frustrating? Tell me if you'd enjoy the slow rhythm or miss staying up late watching shows. Now that we've seen how colonists lived together, we should look at what they wore, because fashion has always found a way to complicate survival. Contrary to popular belief, colonial clothing wasn't all drab brown and gray. People loved color when they could afford it. Indigo, madder red, and saffron yellow were common dyes. Women wore long gowns, aprons, and caps. Men wore breeches, shirts, and coats. And yes, everyone wore a lot of layers, even in summer. Would you tolerate wearing that many layers while working outside in July? Or would you sneakily roll up your sleeves and scandalize the neighbors? Clothing was expensive, so garments were patched, re-dyed, and handed down. Shoes were precious and might be worn until they nearly fell apart. Children often wore miniature versions of adult clothing, including stays, a form of corset, for girls. Would you put up with stiff stays at age 8, or would you ditch them in the barn? Fashion was also a marker of status. The wealthier you were, the more elaborate your clothing could be. A fine silk gown or a powder wig told the world that you had arrived. Would you save up for fancy clothes, or spend your money on something practical like more chickens? Tell me your priorities in the comments, style or survival. After all the work, the fires, the blizzards, the dances, and the church sermons, colonial life ended each day in near total darkness. Just the sound of the night, maybe the crackle of fire, and the knowledge that tomorrow you would do it all again. Would that darkness feel peaceful to you or unsettling? Tell me in the comments if you'd sleep soundly in a colonial house or lie awake listening for wolves. Colonial life was a test of endurance. It asked for patience, skill, and above all, resilience. It was a world where childbirth could be deadly, where winter could be cruel, where neighbors were your lifeline. And yet, it was also a world of hope. Each spring planting, each new baby, each barn raising a reminder that life continued, no matter how hard it was. So, would you last a day or a lifetime in the colonies? Or would you catch the first ship back to Europe? Tell me your answer below. I'd love to hear if you think you'd make it past breakfast. Thank you for staying with me tonight through this slow journey into colonial life. If you've drifted off along the way, that's perfectly fine. That's what we're here for. But if you're still awake, I'd love to know, which part of colonial life do you think would be hardest for you? The childbirth, the work, the danger, or the endless sermons? If you enjoyed this, please like, share, and subscribe so we can keep exploring history together. And leave a comment. I read as many as I can, and I'd love to know which part of tonight's story you found most surprising. Until next time, rest well, and may your fire stay safely in the hearth.